Hello and welcome to this Schritte in die Finsternis, to speak in English, Steps into Darkness, Imperial Fist How to Paint tutorial. Just a small advice to my German-speaking audience. Ein kleiner Hinweis an die deutschsprachigen Zuschauer. Ihr könnt auf den speziell übervertonten Link in der Videobeschreibung klicken, um auf die deutsche Version dieses Tutorials zu kommen. Und jetzt zurück zum Englischen. Now back to English. My goal with this tutorial was it to show you a technique to paint Imperial Fist Space Marines with a nice mustardy yellow color tone that don't require any skills like wet blending or fancy stuff like this. The most magic happens with the Basecoat spray paint and the color sprays I use as the next steps. And the other thing you need for this tutorial is just a steady hand to paint in all these battle damages, the scars, and all the details. The tutorial is sped up by 150%, and the color I use is always shown in the left upper corner of the picture. As you might have recognized, I am not a native English-speaking person, and I hope you may excuse mispronunciation or some false words that I choose. So let us start with the tutorial. This is the build miniature, some grit and sand on the base, and keep in mind that I didn't glue on the backpack while I paint this miniature to keep it separate when I go on the back part of the miniature, sometimes here and there. The first step is to spray paint the miniature in Corax white so that the following colors would be shiny and very bright in the first place. This would be Evil Sun Scarlet from the airbrush or Armypainter Color Primer Dragon Red, sprayed from above and from the sides to get a nice coverage, as you see here. The next step is Averland Sunset, Citadel Spray or Citadel Air color on equivalent like Vallejo Golden Yellow, sprayed from up above the miniature and in a 55-degree angle from the sides to get a zenithal highlight. This one would produce a nice orangey reddish shadow in the down parts cause we sprayed red before. As you may have recognized, the moisture out there while priming wasn't the best and the surface looked a little bit rough, but this doesn't matter for this tutorial called we want to have this Space Marine roughed up, and you don't have to be like having a nervous breakdown while this happens. This is okay for this miniature. After the Averland Sunset spray coat has dried out, I use some technique like recess shading, and I use Seraphim Sepia and Lahmian medium in a 50-50 mix and put it down in all these little recesses, nooks and crannies all around the yellow armor. If you hit some of the armor panels, doesn't panic. You just need to wash out your brush and go on these armor panels with a damp brush and wash the glaze, I want to call it, away. And the fine thing, this is the main color we need for our armor. Then there is only the edge highlighting and everything is fine. So keep a steady fine painting with your brush and you don't have to repair the color paint afterwards. To increase the depth of some of these shade areas I recessed shaded in, I use Reikland Fleshshade for some of the darker recesses and apply it like before. Down there on the legs, on the back, under the energy backpack, on the lower parts of the shoulder pauldrons, on the kneecaps lower parts, under the arms and all around there. Just apply a tiny amount of Reikland Fleshshade to give this yellowish shadow a little bit of a reddish tint. If you mess up, don't worry. You just can use Citadel layer color Averland Sunset to get some of these yellow coloration back. It's not the end of the world if you spill the shade over. And for that, the shading of all these armor parts is done. Really awesome. Now, let's go to the edge highlighting. Ushabti bone is a first color to grab, and I pick all these sharp edges around the armor. Important, just paint in some small dots or interrupted lines to give it the appearance of a roughed up Space Marines, and paint some dots and small fine lines within the armor paneled surfaces like this, and some scratches from the edge into the surface so that it's roughed up and beaten and bruised by many days, weeks or even years fighting Necron on the battlefield. The more you paint in these quote-unquote battle damage, the grim, darker and roughed up the miniature looks, and you can use this technique if you want to have a shiny Space Marine. Just paint straight lines on the edges. If you want to have a roughed up, really battle-hardened veteran, then paint these small segments like I did here in this video. Next step is some additional highlighting on these roughed up edges, and I use Screaming Skull for this. It's important to get yourself a picture in your mind from where the light hits the miniature, in this case from the front right upper part. So I highlight some parts on the helmet, on the chest area, on the belt, the right side, and the upper part of the kneecap, and the right side of these shin armor, like I show here with the brush. This is the way where the light hits the miniature. Don't get stressed when these edges and these roughed up pieces are a little bit too thick in its appearance, cause we paint in some brownish color later for these chips where the color is removed and you see the rust protection paint underneath. And this is the next step. I use Catachan flesh tone, a reddish brown tone, and pick out some of these places where I painted the edge highlights before, and paint there just above all these scratches the color like you see here, to give the appearance that the armor's color is scratched, rubbed or wiped away, melted away, whatever, and the rust protection layer of these ceramic armors is shown through. And even with this stage, as before with the battle damage, you can decide, is it a more of a bright, shiny warrior, or a very, very grim, dark, even gothic, noir, battle-hardened veteran that's seen armor maintenance since 6 or 7 months ago. So just feel free, fiddle around and find the ratio of battle damage you like. Funny thing, then the armor is completely done. Keep a steady hand and paint just the areas you need for the next parts, so you don't need to clean up anything of this paint, and you will paint your miniature very, very fast, I think. Next step, red parts. This Aquila, or better to say winged skull, on the chest piece and these little purity seal on the backpack, this miniature got one there, is painted with a base coat for the reddish colors, Gal Vorbak red. I want a grim, dark appearance, and so the red needs to be darkened down for the base color so that it's not too bright at the end. Just apply 1, 2 or maybe 3 coats, cause even Citadel Gal Vorbak red is a base color. It's just very, very light and transparent if you paint it on there. The next color I use is the next reddish, brighter color I could find on my working desk, and it's Khorne red. With this color I paint the first highlight. The wings are painted, these upper parts of the wings, and these stylized feathers are painted from the edge, from the outward edge to the inner parts, so that on the inner parts of the stylized feathers you see the Gal Vorbak red through. Also paint the upper part of the skull and these nose piece, and don't forget the purity seal on the back. There you can leave some of the darker areas showing through for some shading or shadow areas. The next color is even brighter, Mephiston red, just a pure signal red-like color, and there I paint the tips of the stylized feathers, a small amount of the skull's forehead and nose part, and some pieces on the purity seal. As you may have recognized, I use shades very, very sparingly, and I want to challenge you to do the same, cause you can improve your painting like this, and you spare time and money, cause these shades are damn expensive, and I don't think it's very useful to paint the base color, shade over it, and paint the base color again to clean it up and stuff like this. So I recommend you to paint with shades more like glazes. Next step, small step, Wild Rider red on the purity seal to give it a little bit more of another color variation, another reddish tone. And then I take Fire Dragon Bright on the tips of the stylized feathers to give it kinda a non-metallic metal shiny bit, and the final highlight there. A dot on the wing's upper part, there, and some small lines on the skulls in the next step. Why did I use another reddish tone on the purity seal? Very simple, some of these miniatures got their Aquila and their purity seal on the same side for the viewer, and then it would be a bit more interesting if you got different red tones. Now to get our red and yellow warrior onto the level of a Space Marine, we need some another paints. This is the paint for the weapons and the armor trims, maybe kneecaps and stuff like this. Abaddon black straight out of the pot, 2 or 3 coats on all these parts, paint steady and controlled over your brush, and you're good to go. You need at least 3 coats, cause black on yellow is nearly like painting yellow over black. This doesn't apply very well, but it's better to prime the miniature in yellow and paint this one now in black than the other way around. First step for highlighting these black parts, Corvus black and really dark gray. This would be painted on all the upper parts of the metal. You see here on the kneecaps left side and upper side, on the shoulder rims or trims, upper parts to give it a more grayish appearance on the armor or weapon casing, I want to say. Upper parts and side parts, just to give it some color variation, but don't get it too grayish. And in addition, to lessen the contrast between the mustardy yellow and these dark black parts. And you see the color difference here while I paint the chainsword's casing. Next step for the black parts is Eshin Gray, an edge highlight on all these armor or weapon casings or the armor trims. And these connecting pieces between the armor, they are called soft armor, I think. I don't know right now from the top of my head. And you set the edge highlights on the armor pieces and the weapons casings, also like you painted these scratches and edges on the armor to keep the vibe, the feel of the whole miniature together. Some lines here and there, scratches here and there. The more scratches, the roughened up the warrior looks. The next step isn't gray for the pauldrons as you may think. We will use some brown colors and some beige grayish colors for the leather parts, cause the next color we need for the black parts to highlight them would be the final highlight for these leathery parts. So I introduce this color here, Dryad Bark, dark, cool brown color, cool by temperature appearance, and paint all the leather parts, these pouches, the handle and the grip of the pistol and the chainsword. And maybe he got books or holsters or stuff like this. All this is painted with Dryad Bark. After this, I apply Skaven Blight Dinger in a edge highlight style on all these leathery parts, like before we painted the armor and the weapons casings. In the case of the leather parts, I paint more of these straight lines on the edges to give it a little bit different feeling to these whole metal armor and metal weapon casings. Cause leather is a natural material. I think this would be leather even in the 41st millennium, so I want to give it a bit of another surface texture. Next step for the leather parts is Storm Vermin Fur, same as before. Some dots here, some lines there, rough up the metal material a little bit. And if you don't like these grayish leather parts, just keep in mind that you can change the colors after Dryad Bark to Mornfang Brown and Scrag Brown to give it more of an orangey appearance, or you can go to Doombull Brown and Tuskor Fur for a more fleshy, pinkish appearance. Your creativity is your limitation. Now I take Dawnstone. This would be the last highlight on all the leathery parts and these soft armor parts. Just paint the color in where the light would hit these places. Keep in mind that there would be a backpack on the above the pouches in the back, so you don't need these highlights there, and paint in some more of these small lines and dots on the whole armor trims and the weapons casing to give it an even roughed up appearance. The more you apply this color, the more the veteran status of this marine counts. And as a last highlight, I apply Administratum Gray on the black parts. These would be the places where there's the most shiny bits on the armor, the deepest scratches, or better to say, the sharpest edges around a scratch, and some of these dots there on the chainsword visualize it very well. There would be the sharpest edges of these roughed up surfaces where the light would reflect the most. And with this step, all these black parts are done. Congratulations! Next we go to the Eyelenses and maybe some weapons, targeting, optics you can paint the same way. Just paint in Caliban green onto the lances and keep your hands steady. And don't mind mistakes, you just can take Averland Sunset to clean up everything and paint another edge highlight with Ushabti bone in later when you have painted the eyes. Next step would be Warpstone glow, the front part of the eyelens, maybe something like 2/3 to 3/4 of the length of the lens, painted in Warpstone glow on both sides, steady, and you can flip up the miniature like this to reach the places better. And after this is the last highlight in the front part of the lens. It's mood green, like venomous, greenish, bright color for the final highlight in the front. Round about 1/5 to 1/3 of the whole lens surface. Last step is a small dot of white scar in the back upper corner of the lens to give it a reflection point. And if you may ask, why paint yellow armor, red Aquila and green eyes? It's very simple. The green is the complementary paint to the red Aquila, and I want to include some complementary paints like this. Next, all these parchment papers, purity seals or oath of the moment, painted as a base coat with Steel Legion drab. There are some purity seals and some of the Marines got parchment paper style ornaments on their armor. You can paint it in the same color to give it a bit more of variation. And the goal is to paint beige desaturated parchment paper. The next step is Corax stone, like you see here, to give it more differentiation between parchment paper and the yellow armor. You see in the next step I paint the final highlight on the parchment paper with Rakarth flesh. You could maybe, if you like, go over Ushabti bone and Screaming Skull, but I think this one would be too near to the edge highlights of the armor and wouldn't separate the parchment paper optical enough from the rest of the miniature. After you painted in these small highlights on the left side of the parchment paper, on the upper side, you could decide to get some scribe work in. I take Catachan Fleshshade for this and draw some really small lines to give the illusion of some scripture on there. If you are very fancy and could do it, you could even paint in some symbols like an Imperial Fists icon or an Aquila or some Roman numerals or stuff like this. I don't paint this small regularly. I paint freehands a bit bigger, like here. I decided to put a 5 on the kneecap troop marking, and this is with Celestial Grey, and the upper part of the 5 would be highlighted with Ulthuan Grey in the next step. Then this is the time to apply decals, like these tactical marking stuff on the right shoulder and these Imperial Fist chapter symbol on the left shoulder. I must apologize, I don't have these decals at hand and don't want to buy decal sheet just for this tutorial. My apologies, but you can do it like this. To pimp up my miniature, I take Abaddon Black and add some scripture on these armor panels. On the shoulder, I paint in a Templar's cross, or on German, a Tatzenkreuz. This cross symbol is found in the Imperial Fists iconography often. It's remnants of the Great Crusade era and the Horus Heresy years, and you can paint in some small lines of scripture on the armor too, like you see here. This would be some honorable mentions why he got approved these Templar's cross, and here and there some prayers or something like this. Just feel free to add these parts if you like to. The next step would be the finishing steps, all the metal parts. I painted the metal parts before in black to give it a good foundation, and now for the goldish metal parts I use Balthasar gold and paint it on there and leave some small pieces of the black shown through to give it a natural shadow. This is these trim on the lower arm and the chain blades, chain swords hilt could be, no, pommel, it's called pommel, could be painted like this. I forget here, but I painted in later, as you may recognize sooner. Now Rune Lord Brass for an highlight, give it a more of a brassy appearance. You could go over Retributor armor and stuff like this, but I used the brass tone to give it more of a differentiation to the mustardy yellow armor color, cause Retributor armor and Liberator gold in this kind of color temperature, it's more of a yellow tone, and I think it wouldn't fit very well. Next step is Iron Warrior for all these silver metal parts. Paint the chain sword's teeth and the heavy bolt pistol parts that are not the bolt pistol casing, and maybe chains and stuff like this that are on the miniature, or some mechanical pieces of fragmentation grenades and stuff like this. Keep in mind that you don't forget those. Lead Belcher for a broad highlight on all these metal parts, and as a final highlight and final edge highlight, all these small teeth would be highlighted with Runefang steel. These brass parts on the arm and the pommel of the sword could get some of these dots of paint too, to give it more of a reflective appearance. And if you like, you can paint in pigments, rusty pigments, or stuff like Nihilic oxide, oxidation on these brass parts to give it more of a grim dark feeling. I think I use these oxide and rust more on Plague Marines than on loyal Space Marines, so these are the last steps for the miniature. The basing of this miniature is applied by your liking. If you want to know how to get this one is the base technique from the Necron tutorial I released yesterday, and the only thing I applied here is a little bit of burnt umber by Vallejo right out of the airbrush to give more of the dusted effect on the lower leg parts of these Marines. I hope you like this tutorial and maybe you paint some of the models. I hope it was helpful and give you some more confidence or release you of your fear that you cannot paint like this. I say it's very easy, just steady hands and be a little bit courageous. You can do this too. It was fun to make this tutorial. I can't thank you enough for watching this video, and a thumbs up or stuff like this would be appreciated. In the future there will be more tutorials that I release on my native language German and give them also an English overdub. So if you wanna stay with these tutorials like 140k or Battletech, Warhammer Fantasy and stuff like this, just give me your subscription on this channel and we'll see again. Till then, I was your Dizzy Finger. Keep on wargaming!